The phone rang for the sixth time, and Claire Bennett stared at it on the kitchen counter without picking it up. Outside, the rain tapped against the window in short, nervous bursts, almost matching the rhythm of her heartbeat. It was their 10th wedding anniversary, and the candles on the table had burned halfway down while the food turned cold. Daniel had promised he would be home by 7. It was now almost 10. She finally answered on the last ring before it would have gone to voicemail again. "I'm sorry, Claire," Daniel said, his voice rushed and distracted. "Something came up at the office, a client emergency. I can't leave right now." Claire closed her eyes and pressed her palm against the cool marble counter. "It's our anniversary, Daniel." I know. We'll celebrate this weekend, I promise." There was noise behind him, laughter, glasses clinking, music that didn't sound like it belonged in an office. Claire almost asked about it, but she didn't. She had learned over the years not to ask too many questions. Questions only led to explanations that made her feel foolish for doubting him in the first place. "Okay," she said quietly, and hung up before he could hear her voice crack. She sat alone at the table for a long time, watching the candle flames flicker and shrink. 10 years ago, she would never have imagined a night like this. 10 years ago, Daniel would have shown up early with flowers even if he had to leave work undone. Somewhere between then and now, something had changed, and Claire wasn't sure exactly when it happened. She only knew that she had slowly become someone who waited. To understand how they had arrived at this quiet, cold kitchen, it helped to go back to the beginning, to a small university library where two strangers had once reached for the same book at the same time. Claire had been 22 then, a bright and hopeful literature student with paint-stained fingers, because she loved painting almost as much as she loved words. Daniel was a year older, studying business, driven and confident in a way that some people found intimidating but Claire found magnetic. Their hands had touched over the spine of an old poetry collection, and both of them had laughed at the coincidence. "You can have it," Daniel had said. "I was just curious. Poetry's not really my thing." "Then why were you reaching for it?" Claire had asked, amused. "Because a beautiful woman was standing in front of the shelf, and I needed an excuse to talk to her." It was a cheesy line, the kind that should have made her roll her eyes, but instead it made her smile so wide her cheeks hurt. That was how it began. Coffee turned into long walks across campus. Long walks turned into late-night phone calls that stretched past midnight. Within a year, they were inseparable, and within 3 years, Daniel proposed to her on the same library steps where they had first met, holding a small ring in one hand and a single sunflower in the other, because he remembered her once mentioning that sunflowers were her favorite. Their wedding was small but full of warmth. Claire's mother cried through the entire ceremony. Daniel's best friend, a cheerful man named Peter, gave a speech that made everyone laugh until their sides hurt. Claire remembered standing at the altar, looking into Daniel's eyes, and feeling certain that whatever life brought them, they would face it together. The early years of their marriage were simple in the best way. They lived in a small apartment with mismatched furniture, most of it second-hand, because neither of them had much money yet. Daniel was working long hours to build a name for himself in finance, and Claire was teaching art classes at a community center while working on her own paintings in the evenings. Money was tight, but their love was not. They would eat instant noodles by candlelight and call it a 5-star dinner. They would dance in their living room to songs playing from an old radio, laughing at how badly Daniel danced despite his confidence in everything else. Claire remembered one particular evening when Daniel came home exhausted after a difficult day, his tie loosened and his shoulders slumped. She had just finished a painting, a small canvas of a sunset over the ocean, and she showed it to him shyly, still unsure of her own talent. He had stood in front of it for a long moment before speaking. "Claire, this is beautiful. You have to keep painting. Promise me you won't stop, no matter how busy things get." "I promise," she had said, and she meant it. At the time, it seemed like such a small, ordinary conversation, the kind of thing couples say to each other without thinking too much about it. But looking back, Claire would remember that promise more than almost anything else, because it was Daniel who eventually made it impossible to keep. In those first years, Daniel was attentive in 100 small ways. He remembered how she took her coffee, and he made it for her every morning without being asked. He noticed when she was upset even before she said a word, and he always found a way to make her laugh again. He introduced her proudly to his colleagues, holding her hand a little tighter whenever they were in a room full of people, as if he wanted the whole world to know she was his. Claire's sister, Olivia, used to tease her about how happy she looked whenever Daniel was around. "You two are disgustingly cute," Olivia would say, rolling her eyes but smiling. "Don't ever let that fade, okay? I've seen too many couples lose that spark." "We won't," Claire had said with the easy confidence of someone who had never been given a reason to doubt it. Daniel's hard work eventually began to pay off. He was promoted twice within 3 years, moving from a junior analyst to a respected manager at his firm. With each promotion came more responsibility, longer hours, and more late nights at the office. Claire didn't mind at first. She understood ambition. She had her own dreams too, and she supported his fully, telling herself that this was simply what building a future together looked like. Sacrifice now, comfort later. That was the unspoken agreement between them. She began adjusting her life around his schedule without even realizing it. She stopped waiting for him to eat dinner together and started eating alone, saving him a plate that often sat untouched until the next morning. She stopped mentioning her art classes because he seemed too tired to listen after a long day, and she didn't want to burden him further. She told herself this was what marriage required, patience and understanding, and she prided herself on being the kind of wife who didn't complain. There were moments, though, small quiet moments, when a flicker of loneliness crept into her chest. She remembered one night sitting on their bed at 11 o'clock, still fully dressed, waiting for Daniel to come home so they could talk about her day. She had a small piece of good news to share. One of her students had won a regional art competition, and she was excited to tell him. But when he finally walked in, he barely looked at her before heading straight to the shower, mumbling something about a headache and an early meeting the next day. She hadn't said anything that night. She simply turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, listening to the water running in the bathroom, feeling a strange, hollow ache she couldn't quite name. Still, these moments were rare in the early years, easy to brush aside as simply part of the demands of a growing career. Daniel still made an effort in ways that mattered. He surprised her with weekend trips when he could manage the time off. He still whispered that he loved her before falling asleep most nights. He still, occasionally, looked at her the way he had looked at her back in that university library, like she was the most interesting person in the room. It was during their 5th year of marriage that Daniel decided to start his own consulting firm. Tired of working under executives he felt didn't appreciate his talent. Claire supported the decision wholeheartedly, even offering some of her own modest savings to help cover the initial costs. She believed in him completely, and in many ways she was right too. Within 2 years, Daniel's company began attracting serious clients. Within 4 years, it had grown into something impressive, with a small but respected team working under him and a client list that included some well-known local businesses. Success changed things, slowly at first and then all at once. Daniel began traveling more frequently for client meetings, sometimes gone for 3 or 4 days at a time. He started attending dinners and events where spouses were not always invited, networking late into the night with people whose names Claire didn't recognize. He began carrying 2 phones, one for personal use and one strictly for business, explaining that it helped him separate work from home life. Claire accepted this explanation without much thought at the time. It made logical sense after all. What she didn't immediately notice was how the balance between them had quietly shifted. Where Daniel once made time for her without being asked, she now had to specifically request moments of his attention. Where he once remembered small details about her days, she now found herself repeating things twice because he had been distracted the first time she mentioned them. One evening, Claire mentioned that she wanted to hold a small exhibition of her paintings at a local gallery, something she had been dreaming about for years. Daniel nodded along as she spoke, but his eyes kept drifting to his phone screen, thumb scrolling absent-mindedly. "That's great, babe," he he said when she finished. You should definitely do that. Did you hear what I said about the date? Claire asked gently. It's the same weekend as your company's anniversary dinner. I wanted to know if you could still make it. Daniel looked up, his expression apologetic but firm. I don't think I can miss that dinner, Claire. It's important for the business, but you should still do the exhibition. I'll try to stop by if I can. He didn't stop by. Claire stood in the small gallery that night, surrounded by strangers admiring her work, accepting compliments with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, glancing toward the door every few minutes in case he walked through it. He never did. She told herself it was fine. She told herself that this was simply the cost of loving someone with big ambitions. She told herself many things during those years, quiet reassurances she repeated to herself like prayers, hoping that if she said them enough times, they would stop feeling like excuses and start feeling true again. But somewhere deep inside her, a small and persistent voice had already begun to whisper that something important was slipping away. One missed dinner, one unanswered call, one distracted conversation at a time. Claire wasn't ready to listen to that voice yet. She wasn't ready to admit that the man she had married, the one who once promised never to let her stop painting, was slowly becoming someone she barely recognized. She had no idea, sitting alone that rainy anniversary night with cold food and burned-down candles, that this quiet fading was only the beginning of something far more painful. She had no idea that the man on the other end of the phone, laughing among strangers while she waited at home, was already keeping secrets that would one day shatter everything she believed her marriage to be. For now, she simply blew out the candles one by one and told herself that tomorrow would be better. It rarely was. The knock on the office door came sharp and fast, and Claire looked up from the stack of unpaid invoices to see Grace standing there, her face pale, her coat still dripping from the rain outside. Claire, you need to sit down, Grace said. I am sitting down, Claire replied, confused, setting her pen aside. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Grace hesitated, twisting her fingers together the way she always did when she was nervous. I saw Daniel today, at the Hillcrest Hotel, around noon. Claire felt her stomach tighten, though she wasn't sure why yet. Okay, he probably had a client meeting there. He does that sometimes. He wasn't alone, Claire, and it didn't look like a meeting. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unwelcome. Claire wanted to laugh it off, to tell Grace she was overthinking things, that Daniel had told her that very morning he had back-to-back appointments all day with potential investors. But something in Grace's expression stopped her. Grace wasn't the type to gossip or exaggerate. If anything, she was the type to stay quiet even when she probably shouldn't. Who was he with? Claire finally asked, her voice quieter than she intended. I don't know her name. Younger woman, dark hair, very well dressed. They were sitting close together at a corner table, and he had his hand on top of hers at one point. I only saw it for a second before they noticed me and I left. I didn't want to make things awkward, but I couldn't just say nothing to you either. Claire sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the stack of papers on her desk without really seeing them. Her mind raced through possibilities, searching desperately for an innocent explanation. A colleague, a potential client, a business partner's wife. Anything but the obvious answer that Grace's words seemed to be circling around without ever quite saying out loud. It's probably nothing, Claire said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. Daniel works with a lot of women. It doesn't mean anything. Grace didn't push further, though the look on her face said she wasn't entirely convinced either. She squeezed Claire's shoulder gently before leaving, promising to check in later, and Claire sat alone in her small office at the community center, staring blankly at the wall, replaying the conversation over and over in her mind. That evening, when Daniel came home, Claire watched him carefully as he set down his briefcase and loosened his tie, the same routine he followed every single day. He looked tired but otherwise normal, kissing her cheek briefly before heading to the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water. How was your day? Claire asked, keeping her voice light. Long, exhausting. I had back-to-back meetings all afternoon, Daniel said, leaning against the counter. What about you? How were the classes? Good, busy. Claire paused, watching his face closely. Did you go anywhere for lunch today? Grace mentioned she thought she saw you near Hillcrest. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Daniel's expression, so brief that Claire almost convinced herself she had imagined it. Then his face settled back into calm ease, and he shrugged casually. Yeah, I had lunch with a potential investor there. Older guy, very particular about where he eats. Why did Grace say something? She just mentioned seeing you, Claire said carefully, choosing her words. She said you were with a woman. Daniel laughed, a short, easy laugh that sounded completely natural. That was probably his assistant. She joined us halfway through to go over some paperwork. Small world that Grace happened to be there too. The explanation was smooth, logical, delivered without hesitation. Claire wanted to believe it, and in that moment she chose to. It was easier than the alternative. It fit neatly into the version of her marriage she had built in her mind, one where Daniel was simply busy and distracted, not dishonest. Okay, she said, nodding, just checking. You don't have to be jealous, Claire, Daniel said, pulling her into a brief hug. You know you're the only one for me. She let herself relax into his arms, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne, telling herself that Grace had simply misread an innocent situation. It wouldn't be the last time Claire chose to believe an explanation, because the truth felt too frightening to consider. Over the following months, small inconsistencies began to accumulate, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, but together forming a pattern that Claire tried very hard not to notice. Daniel's business trips became more frequent, sometimes overlapping with client emergencies she couldn't verify. His second phone, the one strictly for work, started staying locked even at home, something he hadn't done before. He began coming home later on nights, when he claimed there were no scheduled meetings at all. Claire found herself doing things she never imagined she would do, glancing at the call log on the home phone bill, noticing unfamiliar numbers that appeared repeatedly late at night. She would open her mouth to ask about them, then close it again, afraid of what the answer might be, afraid of being called paranoid, afraid of damaging a trust she had spent years building. Her own dreams, meanwhile, continued to quietly shrink to make room for his growing world. The gallery exhibition she had once hoped for kept getting postponed, first because of scheduling conflicts, then because she simply didn't have the energy to organize it alone. Her painting supplies gathered dust in the corner of their spare room, canvases left half-finished, brushes stiff from lack of use. She told herself she would return to it once things settled down, once Daniel's business stabilized, once life felt less like a constant scramble to keep up. One afternoon, Olivia visited unannounced, finding Claire curled up on the couch in old clothes, the television on but unwatched, a cup of cold tea sitting untouched on the table. You look exhausted, Olivia said, sitting down beside her. When was the last time you painted something, or did something just for yourself? Claire tried to think of an answer and found she couldn't quite remember. It's been a while, she admitted quietly. Daniel's been so busy with the business. I feel like I need to be flexible, support him while he builds this. And who's supporting you? Olivia asked, her voice gentle but pointed. Claire, marriage is supposed to go both ways. You've given up so much of yourself these past few years, and I'm not sure Daniel even notices. He notices, Claire said, though even as she said it, she wasn't entirely certain it was true. He's just going through a demanding phase. It'll get better. Olivia studied her sister for a long moment, clearly wanting to say more but choosing to hold back. Just promise me you won't completely disappear into his life, okay? You matter too, Claire. Your dreams matter too. Claire nodded, though the promise felt distant, almost theoretical, like something she agreed to without truly believing she had the power to keep it anymore. She had spent so long adjusting herself around Daniel's schedule, his moods, his ambitions, that she had lost track of where his needs ended and her own began. A few weeks later, Daniel came home unexpectedly early, humming to himself as he walked through the door, seemingly in an unusually good mood. He kissed Claire on the forehead and announced that he had booked them a weekend getaway to celebrate a major deal his company had just closed. "Just the two of us," he said, smiling widely. "I know I've been distant lately. I want to make it up to you." Claire felt a rush of hope, a small flicker of the old warmth she used to feel around him, and she allowed herself to believe that this was a turning point, that whatever distance had grown between them over the past year was finally about to close. The weekend trip was, in many ways, wonderful. They stayed at a quiet lakeside cabin, took long walks along the water, cooked meals together in the small kitchen, and talked late into the night about nothing in particular, the way they used to before ambition and exhaustion had crowded out their conversations. Claire allowed herself to relax completely, convincing herself that all the small doubts and suspicions from the previous months had simply been the product of stress and overthinking. On the last night of the trip, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars, Daniel took her hand and said quietly, "I know I haven't been the husband you deserve lately. I want to fix that. I promise, things are going to change." Claire believed him completely in that moment. She wanted to believe him. And for a few weeks after they returned home, things did seem different. Daniel made more effort to be present, coming home earlier, putting his second phone away during dinner, asking genuine questions about her day and actually listening to the answers. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the old patterns began creeping back. The early nights became late nights again. The genuine questions became distracted nods. The promises made under the stars at the lakeside cabin began to feel like a beautiful memory from a different version of their marriage, one that Claire increasingly suspected might not return. She didn't know it yet, but that lakeside weekend, meant to repair the growing distance between them, was actually the last true moment of connection they would share before everything began to unravel completely. The warning signs Grace had tried to point out, the ones Claire had explained away so easily, were only the very beginning of a much larger deception, one that had already been carefully constructed long before that rainy hotel afternoon, and one that would soon become impossible for Claire to ignore no matter how badly she wanted to. The ballroom of the Grandview Hotel glittered with soft golden light, chandeliers casting warm reflections across polished marble floors. Claire stood near the edge of the room in a deep blue dress she had chosen carefully weeks in advance, watching Daniel work the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, laughing at jokes, introducing himself to people whose names she was expected to remember for future reference. It was the 5th anniversary celebration of Daniel's company, and the guest list included investors, clients, and prominent figures from the business community. Claire had looked forward to this evening for weeks, hoping it would feel like a shared celebration of everything they had built together, a rare public moment where she could stand beside her husband and feel like part of his world, rather than someone quietly orbiting it. Instead, she found herself standing alone for long stretches of the evening, sipping a glass of champagne that had gone warm in her hand, watching Daniel move confidently from group to group without ever quite pulling her into the conversation. Twice, she approached him mid-conversation, and twice, he introduced her simply as "my wife" before quickly redirecting attention back to business matters, as though her presence was a footnote rather than a fixture in his life. "And this must be the talented Mrs. Bennet I've heard about," said an older gentleman at one point, extending his hand warmly. "Daniel mentioned you're quite the painter." Claire brightened immediately, surprised and pleased that Daniel had spoken about her work at all. "Yes, I teach art classes and paint in my free time. It's wonderful to meet you." Before she could say more, Daniel's hand settled on the man's shoulder, steering him gently but firmly toward another group across the room. "Actually, Harold, there's someone I want you to meet. Excuse us for a moment, Claire." She watched them walk away, the warm smile fading slowly from her face as she stood alone once again amid the swirl of unfamiliar guests. It wasn't the first time that evening it had happened, and by the time the formal dinner began, Claire found herself seated not beside Daniel, as she had expected, but 3 seats down, separated by 2 business associates deep in conversation about quarterly earnings. She picked at her food, smiling politely when spoken to, feeling increasingly like a decorative accessory rather than an equal partner in the life she had helped build. Across the table, Daniel laughed loudly at something one of his colleagues said, utterly absorbed in the conversation, seemingly unaware of how invisible his wife had become in the space of a single evening. Later, during a brief lull, a woman Claire didn't recognize approached her with a curious smile. She introduced herself as Megan, explaining that she worked closely with Daniel on several of the firm's larger accounts. "You must be so proud of everything he's accomplished," Megan said, her tone warm but oddly familiar, as though she knew Claire far better than a simple work acquaintance would. "He talks about the business constantly, though I suppose he doesn't talk much about home life at the office." Something about the comment sat strangely with Claire, though she couldn't immediately place why. "I suppose that's true of most people at work," she said carefully. "It's nice to meet you, Megan." "Likewise," Megan said, her smile lingering a moment longer than felt entirely natural before she excused herself and disappeared back into the crowd. Claire spent the rest of the evening quietly observing, noticing things she had perhaps chosen not to notice before. The way Daniel's second phone buzzed repeatedly throughout dinner, prompting him to excuse himself twice to take an important call. The way his gaze occasionally drifted toward a particular corner of the room where Megan stood laughing with a small group. The way, when Claire finally caught his attention near the end of the night and suggested they leave, he seemed almost reluctant, glancing back over his shoulder as they walked toward the exit. On the drive home, Claire sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, turning the evening over in her mind. Daniel hummed along to the radio, seemingly in good spirits, entirely unaware of the storm of doubt building silently beside him. "You were quiet tonight," he said eventually, glancing at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "I felt a little out of place," Claire admitted. "I barely got to talk to you the entire evening." "It was a work event, Claire. Networking is important, you know that." "I know," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I just wish it didn't feel like I was invisible at my own husband's celebration." Daniel sighed, the sound carrying a note of impatience rather than understanding. "I'm sorry you felt that way. I was trying to make good impressions for the business. That benefits both of us, you know." Claire didn't respond, staring instead at her own reflection faintly visible in the passenger window, wondering when exactly she had become someone whose feelings required an apology rather than genuine consideration. The following week, Claire met Olivia for lunch at a small cafe near the community center, and she found herself recounting the events of the anniversary dinner almost involuntarily, the words spilling out faster than she intended. "He introduced me as just his wife, like I was some kind of accessory," Claire said, stirring her coffee absently. "And there was this woman, Megan, who said something strange about him not talking about home life at the office. It felt off, Olivia. I can't explain it, but something felt wrong." Olivia's expression grew serious, her earlier teasing tone from months before entirely gone. "Claire, I need you to actually listen to what you're telling me right now. You've mentioned 3 or 4 strange things over the past several months: the hotel Grace saw him at, the late nights, the locked phone, now this woman at the dinner. At what point do you start connecting these dots instead of finding separate explanations for each one?" Claire opened her mouth to defend Daniel automatically, the way she always did, but the words wouldn't come this time. Instead, she felt a cold, uncomfortable weight settle in her chest, the beginning of a realization she had been carefully avoiding for far too long. "I don't want to believe it," Claire admitted quietly. "I don't want to be the woman who ignores obvious signs because she's too afraid to face the truth." "Then don't be," Olivia said gently, reaching across the table to squeeze her sister's hand. "Pay attention, Claire, trust yourself. You're not imagining things." That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Claire lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every small inconsistency from the past year in rapid succession. She thought about the hotel Grace had mentioned, the increasingly frequent business trips, the second phone that never left his side, The way he had steered important introductions away from her at his own company event. The strange familiarity in Megan's tone. Individually, each moment could be explained away, dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. But together, laid out clearly in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, they formed a pattern that Claire could no longer ignore, no matter how desperately some part of her still wanted to. She thought about the promise Daniel had made years ago, standing in front of her painting, telling her never to stop, and she wondered when exactly he had stopped keeping promises to her in return. She thought about the lakeside cabin, the stars, his whispered apology, and she wondered whether that moment of genuine connection had been real or simply a temporary performance meant to ease a guilty conscience before returning to whatever double life he had quietly built for himself. For the first time in months, Claire allowed herself to fully acknowledge the fear that had been building steadily beneath the surface of her carefully maintained calm. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong for a long time, and she could no longer keep pretending otherwise simply because the truth felt too painful to face directly. Beside her, Daniel slept peacefully, undisturbed by the quiet storm gathering in his wife's mind. He had no idea that the careful walls he had built around his double life were beginning to show cracks, small but undeniable, and that the woman he had once promised to cherish forever was finally, slowly, beginning to see him clearly for the first time in years. The next morning, Claire woke early before her alarm, before Daniel stirred beside her. She lay quietly in the pale morning light, watching him sleep, studying the familiar lines of his face, searching for some trace of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago in the university library. She found herself, and this frightened her more than anything else that had happened so far, no longer entirely certain that man still existed. Quietly, without waking him, Claire got out of bed, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat alone at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the sun slowly rose over the quiet street outside. She didn't yet know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she could not continue living inside the comfortable silence she had maintained for so long. Something had shifted inside her overnight, a quiet resolve beginning to take root beneath the fear and uncertainty. She was done explaining away things that deserved real answers. She was done making herself smaller to accommodate a distance that had grown far too wide to ignore. Whatever the truth turned out to be, painful or otherwise, Claire decided, sitting alone in the early morning light, that she was finally ready to find it. Claire began paying closer attention, quietly and carefully, without drawing attention to the shift taking place within her. She no longer accepted vague explanations at face value, though she was careful not to reveal her growing suspicion, worried that if Daniel sensed she was watching him more closely, he would simply become more skilled at hiding whatever it was he didn't want her to see. The first opportunity came on a Tuesday evening when Daniel mentioned, almost casually, that he needed to attend a dinner meeting with an out-of-town client and would likely be home late. Claire nodded and wished him well, but after he left, she found herself unable to settle into her usual evening routine. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular, her mind circling back repeatedly to Olivia's words from their lunch conversation. Pay attention. Trust yourself. Around 9 that evening, needing something to occupy her restless mind, Claire opened the small drawer in the hallway where they kept old bank statements and household paperwork. She wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for, only that she felt an urgent need to look. She sifted through several months of records, mostly familiar, mundane transactions, groceries, utility bills, the mortgage payment. Then she found it, tucked between two ordinary statements, a charge from a florist she didn't recognize, dated several weeks earlier, for an amount that seemed unusually large for a simple bouquet. Claire stared at the entry for a long moment, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She hadn't received any flowers recently, certainly nothing that would justify such an expense. She told herself there could be an innocent explanation, flowers for a client, perhaps, or a gift for a business associate's special occasion. But even as she constructed these explanations in her mind, she recognized the familiar pattern of her own denial, the same mental gymnastics she had performed a dozen times before to avoid confronting an uncomfortable truth. This time, she decided, she wouldn't simply let it go. When Daniel returned home that night, well past 11, Claire was waiting in the living room, the lamp casting a soft glow across the room. He looked tired, his tie loosened, his expression carefully composed as he set his bag down near the door. "You're still up," he said, sounding mildly surprised. "I wanted to ask you something," Claire said, keeping her voice calm and even. "I saw a charge from a florist on our statement. Do you know what that was for?" Daniel's expression flickered just for a moment before settling into practiced ease. "Oh, that was for the office. We sent flowers to a client who had surgery recently. Standard business courtesy." "It seemed like a lot for office flowers," Claire said gently, watching his face closely. "Well, it was a large arrangement. She's an important client," Daniel replied, his tone slightly clipped now, carrying the faintest edge of irritation. "Why are you going through our bank statements, Claire? Is something wrong?" The question was deflection, and Claire recognized it as such, but she also recognized the danger of pushing too hard too quickly. "Nothing's wrong," she said carefully. "I was just organizing paperwork and noticed it. That's all." Daniel studied her for a moment longer, something calculating behind his tired eyes, before his expression softened again. "I'm sorry if it seemed strange. I should have mentioned it. It's been a long day, and I forgot to run it by you." He crossed the room and pulled her into a brief hug, and Claire let him, though something inside her remained tense and unconvinced. The explanation was plausible, technically possible, but it didn't entirely erase the growing unease settling in her chest. Over the following weeks, Claire continued her quiet observations, cataloging small details she had previously dismissed. She noticed that Daniel had started showering immediately upon returning home from certain business trips, something he rarely used to do. She noticed that his cologne had changed slightly, a different scent than the one he usually wore, one he explained as a gift from a colleague that he decided to try. She noticed that his second phone, once occasionally left visible around the house, now never left his pocket, even during quiet evenings at home. Each observation on its own seemed small, almost insignificant, easily explained by ordinary life circumstances. But Claire had learned, through painful experience, not to dismiss the accumulating pattern any longer. One Saturday afternoon, while Daniel was out running errands, Claire found herself standing in front of his home office door, her hand resting on the handle, hesitating. She had never once, in 10 years of marriage, gone through his personal belongings without permission. It felt like a betrayal of the trust that had once defined their relationship, even as some part of her recognized the painful irony that trust seemed to have already been broken by someone else entirely. She opened the door and stepped inside. The office was neat and organized, as always, files stacked precisely, his desk clear except for a laptop and a small framed photograph of the two of them from their honeymoon. Claire stood there for a moment, studying the photograph, remembering the carefree happiness captured in that image, feeling an ache of grief for something she wasn't entirely sure was already lost. She didn't find anything unusual in the desk drawers, mostly business documents, receipts, and old invoices. She was about to leave, feeling foolish for having searched at all, when her eyes landed on a small notebook tucked behind a stack of files on the bookshelf. It wasn't hidden exactly, simply overlooked, easy to miss unless someone was specifically looking. Claire opened it carefully, flipping through pages filled with what appeared to be personal notes, reminders, and small sketches related to his business plans. Near the middle of the notebook, however, she found something that made her breath catch, a page with a name written multiple times in the margins, practiced almost like a signature. Megan. Beneath the name, in smaller handwriting, were a few brief notes. A restaurant name, a date, and the words, "Don't forget, her birthday is next week." Claire stood frozen, staring at the page, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It could still be innocent, she told herself desperately. Colleagues remembered each other's birthdays sometimes. It didn't necessarily mean anything more than professional courtesy. But the careful, repeated writing of the name, almost affectionate in its precision, told a different story, one Claire wasn't ready to fully accept yet, even as the evidence continued mounting in front of her. She closed the notebook and placed it back exactly where she had found it, her hands trembling slightly as she left the office and closed the door behind her. She sat down heavily on the living room couch, staring blankly at the wall, feeling as though the ground beneath her had shifted without warning. When Daniel returned home an hour later, cheerful and carrying grocery bags, Claire forced herself to smile and help him put things away, saying nothing about what she had found. She wasn't ready yet to confront him directly. She needed more than a name written in a notebook. She needed something undeniable, something that would leave no room for smooth explanations and practiced excuses. That evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Claire sat alone in the dim living room, her laptop open in front of her, staring at the login page for their shared cell phone account. She had access to the billing details, though she had never once thought to examine the call logs closely before. Her hands hesitated over the keyboard for a long moment before she finally entered the password and pulled up the detailed statement. There, listed among dozens of unfamiliar numbers, was one that appeared repeatedly, sometimes multiple times a day, always late at night or during hours Daniel claimed to be in meetings. Claire copied the number down carefully, her heart pounding, unsure yet what she intended to do with it, only certain that she could no longer ignore the growing weight of evidence accumulating around her. She thought about calling Grace, about confiding in Olivia again, about simply confronting Daniel directly with everything she had found so far. But something held her back, a quiet instinct telling her that she needed to understand the full picture before taking any irreversible step. Sitting alone in the darkened living room, the laptop's glow illuminating her tired, troubled face, Claire made a quiet decision. She would find out the truth, completely and undeniably, no matter how painful that process turned out to be. She owed herself that much, after years of quietly accepting explanations that no longer made sense. After years of shrinking herself to accommodate a distance she now understood had been deliberately created and carefully maintained. She closed the laptop and sat in the darkness for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of rain beginning to fall outside, and somewhere upstairs, the steady, undisturbed breathing of a husband who had no idea that his wife was finally, irreversibly, beginning to see through the careful life he had built around his deception. Grace answered on the second ring, her voice immediately alert despite the late hour. "Claire, is everything okay? It's almost midnight." "I need your help with something," Claire said, sitting cross-legged on her bed, the bedroom door closed and locked, though Daniel was downstairs in his office, working late as he had been for the past several nights. "I found a name. Megan. She works with Daniel. I think something is going on between them, and I need to know for certain before I say anything to him." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you to find out where she lives, what she looks like, anything you can learn about her without raising suspicion. I can't do this myself without Daniel noticing." Grace agreed without hesitation, and over the following days, working carefully and discreetly, she managed to piece together a picture of Megan Whitfield, a senior account manager at Daniel's firm, 29 years old, recently divorced, known among colleagues for her sharp business instincts and easy charm. Grace even managed to find a photograph through a mutual connection on social media, and Claire stared at the image for a long time, studying the face of the woman whose name had been written so carefully, so deliberately, in her husband's private notebook. Armed with this information, Claire began watching more closely, noting the days Daniel claimed to have late meetings, cross-referencing them against a growing mental timeline of inconsistencies. She discovered that his supposed out-of-town client dinners often coincided suspiciously with Megan's absence from the office on the same days, information Grace managed to confirm through a colleague who worked in the same building. 3 weeks after finding the notebook, Claire decided the time had come to see for herself. Daniel had mentioned another late business dinner, this one supposedly with a group of investors at a downtown restaurant. Claire told him she would be attending a painting class that evening, an old excuse she hadn't used in months, but one that still felt believable enough given her renewed interest in returning to her art. Instead, she drove downtown and parked across the street from the restaurant Daniel had mentioned, her heart pounding as she watched the entrance from the dim safety of her car. She waited nearly an hour, second-guessing herself repeatedly, wondering if she was overreacting, if she would see Daniel walk out with a group of business associates exactly as he had described, and feel foolish for doubting him yet again. Instead, she watched him walk out alone with Megan, the two of them laughing together as they exited the restaurant, standing closer than any professional relationship would typically require. Daniel reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair away from Megan's face, a small, intimate gesture that made Claire's stomach twist painfully. She watched them walk together to a nearby parking garage, disappearing from view, and Claire sat frozen in her car for several minutes afterward, tears streaming silently down her face, the confirmation she had both sought and dreaded now undeniable. She didn't confront him that night. Instead, she drove home in a daze, arriving before Daniel, quickly changing into pajamas and pretending to be asleep when he finally returned, smelling faintly of unfamiliar perfume, humming softly to himself as he moved quietly around the bedroom, entirely unaware that his wife had witnessed everything. Over the following days, Claire moved through her life mechanically, teaching her classes, preparing meals, maintaining the careful appearance of normalcy while internally processing the devastating truth she now carried. She continued gathering evidence, not because she needed further confirmation of the affair itself, but because some part of her needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening, needed to know exactly how long this deception had been running beneath the surface of their marriage. She discovered, through careful review of years of old bank and phone records, that the relationship with Megan appeared to have begun nearly 2 years earlier, shortly after Daniel's company secured a major new client account that Megan had helped manage. 2 years of hotel receipts disguised as business expenses. 2 years of late nights explained away as client emergencies. 2 years of Claire quietly adjusting her own life, her own dreams, to accommodate a husband who had been building an entirely separate existence just beneath the surface of the one they supposedly shared. The realization was almost impossible to fully absorb. Claire found herself replaying countless memories from the past 2 years through this new, painful lens, searching for moments she might have missed, conversations that suddenly took on different meaning, absences that now made devastating sense. She remembered a weekend trip Daniel had taken for a supposed industry conference, remembered how he had returned unusually cheerful, practically glowing, and how she had simply been happy to see him in good spirits after months of exhaustion and stress. She remembered him gifting her an expensive bracelet shortly afterward, something he rarely did, and how she had assumed it was simply a gesture of appreciation for her patience during his busy season. Now, she wondered whether it had actually been guilt disguised as generosity. One evening, unable to bear the weight of her discoveries alone any longer, Claire invited Olivia over while Daniel was at another late meeting. She laid everything out for her sister, the notebook, the phone records, the restaurant, the 2 years of carefully constructed lies, and watched Olivia's expression shift from concern to controlled fury as the full picture emerged. "How long have you known?" Olivia asked quietly once Claire had finished. "I confirmed it 3 weeks ago," Claire admitted. "But I think, deep down, I've known something was wrong for much longer. I just wasn't ready to face it." "Claire, you need to confront him. You can't keep carrying this alone." "I know," Claire said, her voice steadier than she expected. "I've just been trying to understand everything first. I needed to know the full truth before I said anything, so he couldn't talk his way around it the way he always does." Olivia reached over and took her sister's hand, her expression softening with sadness and admiration in equal measure. "You've been carrying so much on your own. I wish you had told me sooner." "I wasn't ready," Claire admitted. "I think part of me was still hoping I was wrong." And now, Claire was quiet for a long moment, staring at the small stack of printed evidence spread across the coffee table between them, 2 years of carefully hidden betrayal laid bare in black and white. Now I know exactly what I'm dealing with, she said finally, and I'm ready to face him. That night after Olivia left, Claire sat alone in the quiet house, gathering the evidence into a neat folder, preparing herself mentally for the conversation she knew could no longer be postponed. She thought about the years they had shared, the genuine love that had once existed between them, the promises made at the altar and again at that lakeside cabin. She grieved, quietly and privately, for the marriage she had believed in so completely, even as she steeled herself for what she now understood needed to happen next. She heard Daniel's car pull into the driveway around 11 that evening, and she sat perfectly still on the living room couch, the folder resting on her lap, waiting. She heard his key turn in the lock, heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard him humming softly to himself, the same easy, contented sound she had grown painfully familiar with over the past several months, a sound she now understood belonged to a man who had built an entirely separate happiness for himself, one that existed apart from and at the expense of the life he shared with her. He stepped into the living room, still humming, and stopped abruptly when he saw her sitting there in the dim lamplight, her expression calm but unmistakably serious, the folder resting on her lap like a quiet declaration of everything that was about to change. "Claire," he said, his humming fading into uncertain silence, "is everything okay? Why are you still up?" Claire looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly for what felt like the first time in months, and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "We need to talk, Daniel. And I think you already know what this is about." Daniel's face went through several rapid changes, confusion first, then a flicker of something that might have been fear, before finally settling into a carefully composed mask of calm concern, an expression Claire recognized immediately as the same practiced ease he used in business negotiations. "What are you talking about?" he asked, setting his briefcase down slowly, buying himself time. Claire opened the folder on her lap and began laying items out on the coffee table, one by one, without raising her voice, without dramatic accusations, simply presenting the evidence with a calm precision that seemed to unsettle him far more than shouting would have. "Florist charges for flowers I never received. Hotel receipts labeled as client dinners. A notebook with Megan's name written over and over, along with her birthday. Phone records showing calls to the same number, sometimes multiple times a day, always late at night. And 3 weeks ago I watched you leave a restaurant with her. I watched you touch her hair." Each item landed like a small, precise blow, and Claire watched Daniel's composed expression crumble slightly with every piece of evidence she revealed. He opened his mouth several times as if to speak, then closed it again, seemingly unable to find an explanation smooth enough to counter the overwhelming weight of what she had gathered. "Claire, it's not what you think," he finally managed, his voice quieter now, less confident than she had ever heard it. "Megan and I are close, but nothing has happened between us physically. We work together constantly, and sometimes lines get blurred, but it's not." "Don't," Claire said sharply, cutting him off, her calm finally beginning to crack under the weight of his continued deflection. "Don't insult me by pretending this is some innocent misunderstanding. I've seen 2 years of records, Daniel, 2 years. Don't you dare stand there and tell me nothing happened." Daniel sank into the armchair across from her, running his hands through his hair, the confident businessman facade completely gone now, replaced by something more raw and uncertain. "Okay," he admitted quietly. "Okay, yes, it became more than professional. But Claire, you have to understand, things have been so difficult between us for so long. You've been distant, focused on your painting, on your classes. I felt like I was losing you long before Megan ever became part of the picture." The accusation, deflecting blame onto her own behavior, ignited something fierce in Claire that surprised even herself. "I was distant," she repeated incredulously. "Daniel, I adjusted my entire life around your schedule for years. I gave up exhibitions, postponed my own dreams, ate dinner alone more nights than I can count, all while telling myself it was temporary, that things would eventually get better. And this entire time, you were building a life with someone else, blaming me for a distance you created. That's not fair, Daniel said, his voice rising slightly now, defensive. You don't understand the pressure I've been under building this business, trying to give us a good life. Megan understood that pressure. She was there in that world in a way you never really were. So this is my fault, Claire said flatly, her voice trembling now with barely contained emotion. Because I wasn't sufficiently impressed by your business world, you decided it was acceptable to lie to me for 2 years. Daniel seemed to recognize, belatedly, how poorly his words were landing, and he shifted tactics abruptly, his tone softening, becoming pleading rather than defensive. Claire, please. I know I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I love you, I've always loved you. What happened with Megan, it was never about replacing you. It was a moment of weakness that spiraled out of control. I can end it completely. We can go to counseling, we can fix this. Claire studied him for a long moment, this man she had loved for over a decade, searching his face for some trace of the genuine remorse she desperately wanted to believe was there. Part of her, the part that still remembered the university library, the sunflower proposal, the promise never to stop painting, wanted desperately to believe that this could somehow be repaired, that 2 years of careful deception could be undone through counseling sessions and renewed effort. But another part of her, the part that had spent months quietly gathering evidence, that had sat alone in a car outside a restaurant watching her husband touch another woman's hair, that had spent years slowly shrinking herself to accommodate a distance she now understood had been deliberately manufactured, recognized something Daniel's pleading words couldn't quite disguise. How many times did you lie to my face, Daniel? She asked quietly. How many times did I ask you directly about something, and you looked me in the eyes and lied? Daniel didn't answer immediately, and his silence spoke more clearly than any words could have. The florist charge, Claire continued. The hotel Grace saw you at, every late meeting, every business trip. How many of those were actually about work, and how many were about her? Claire, please, this isn't helping. I need to know, she interrupted, her voice firmer now. I've spent years making excuses for you, defending you to my own sister, ignoring my own instincts because I trusted you completely. I need to understand exactly how much of that trust was misplaced. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his shoulders slumping as though some final resistance within him had finally given way. More than I want to admit, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Most of it, honestly. I'm sorry, Claire. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am truly sorry. The admission, though Claire had already known the truth, still landed with devastating finality, extinguishing whatever small flicker of hope had remained that this might somehow be a smaller betrayal than the evidence suggested. I need you to understand something, Claire said, standing slowly from the couch, gathering the scattered evidence back into its folder with steady, deliberate movements. This isn't just about Megan. This is about 2 years of you looking at me and choosing to lie over and over again while I trusted you completely. That kind of betrayal doesn't get repaired with a few counseling sessions. So what are you saying? Daniel asked, panic beginning to creep into his voice as he watched her calm, deliberate movements. Are you saying it's over? Claire, please, we've built 10 years together. Doesn't that count for something? Claire paused, folder in hand, and looked at him directly, her expression a complicated mixture of grief and resolve. It counted for everything, Daniel. That's exactly why this hurts so much. But you're the one who decided those 10 years weren't enough to keep you faithful. You're the one who chose, repeatedly, deliberately, to build a second life while I remained completely unaware, sacrificing pieces of myself for a marriage that apparently wasn't as important to you as I believed. I can change, Daniel said desperately, standing now, moving toward her. Give me a chance to prove it. Please, Claire, I'm begging you. Claire stepped back slightly, creating distance between them, her voice steady despite the tears now sliding silently down her cheeks. I don't doubt that you're sorry right now, in this moment, faced with the consequences of getting caught. But I can't trust that sorrow to last, Not after everything I've learned tonight. And even if I could, I'm not sure I want to spend the rest of my life wondering, every time you're late, every time your phone buzzes, whether this is happening again." "Please," Daniel repeated, his voice breaking now, genuine desperation replacing his earlier composed defenses. "I'll do anything. I'll end things with Megan completely, tonight, right now if you want. Please don't give up on us." Claire looked at him for a long, silent moment, feeling the weight of 10 years pressing against the devastating clarity of everything she now understood. She thought about the woman she had been in that university library, hopeful and full of dreams, and she thought about the woman she had slowly become over the past several years, quiet and accommodating, shrinking herself to fit into whatever space Daniel's life left available for her. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not making any decisions tonight, but Daniel, I need you to understand something clearly. Whatever happens next, the version of trust we had before tonight is gone. It cannot simply be rebuilt through apologies and promises. That trust took 10 years to build, and you destroyed it in secret, piece by piece, over the course of 2. She walked past him toward the stairs, leaving him standing alone in the living room, his face pale and stricken. The confident, composed man who had walked through the door humming to himself, now replaced by someone Claire barely recognized. Someone whose careful world of lies had finally, completely, collapsed. She climbed the stairs slowly, entered their bedroom, and closed the door quietly behind her, sinking onto the edge of the bed as the full weight of the evening finally caught up with her, grief and anger and exhaustion crashing over her in overwhelming waves. Downstairs, she could hear Daniel moving slowly around the living room, the soft, uneven sound of a man confronting the collapse of the comfortable, deceptive life he had spent 2 years carefully constructing. Claire didn't sleep much that night, but somewhere in the quiet, sleepless hours before dawn, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom she had shared with Daniel for a decade, she felt something shift within her, a quiet, unshakable clarity beginning to settle over the grief and confusion. She didn't yet know exactly what her next steps would look like, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that the woman who had spent years making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's comfort was not the woman she intended to remain. 3 days after the confrontation, Claire sat across from a lawyer named Ellen Whitmore in a small, quiet office downtown, a folder of financial documents spread across the desk between them. She had spent those 3 days in a strange, suspended state, moving through her daily routine mechanically, while Daniel alternated between desperate apologies and long stretches of silence, uncertain how to navigate the wreckage of what he had caused. "Based on what you've described, you have a strong position," Ellen said, reviewing the documents carefully. "Given the financial contributions you made during the early years of his business, along with the clear evidence of infidelity, you're entitled to a fair settlement. But Claire, before we go further into logistics, I need to ask you something important. Are you certain this is the path you want to take? Some clients need more time before committing to something this final." Claire considered the question carefully, thinking about the countless nights she had spent making excuses, adjusting her expectations, quietly shrinking herself into whatever space remained available in Daniel's increasingly divided life. She thought about the notebook with Megan's name written over and over, the 2 years of careful deception, the desperate pleading in Daniel's voice as she had walked away from him in their living room. "I'm certain," she said finally, her voice steady, "I've given this marriage everything I had. I'm not interested in giving it a chance to break me further." Over the following weeks, Claire began the difficult process of separating her life from Daniel's, a process that proved far more complicated emotionally than she had anticipated. She moved temporarily into Olivia's guest bedroom, surrounded by boxes containing a decade's worth of shared belongings that now needed to be carefully divided and sorted. Daniel's attempts to win her back continued relentlessly during this period, each one more desperate than the last. He sent flowers to Olivia's house, ironic given how their conversation had begun, along with handwritten letters detailing promises of change. Therapy sessions he claimed to have already scheduled, and long messages describing exactly how he intended to prove his commitment if only she would give him another chance. Claire read each message carefully, feeling the familiar pull of 10 years of shared history, the genuine love that had once existed between them, the difficulty of extinguishing feelings that had taken over a decade to build. But beneath that familiar pull, she also felt something new and increasingly powerful, a clear-eyed recognition that love alone had never been the problem in their marriage. The problem had been trust, deliberately and repeatedly broken, and no amount of flowers or handwritten apologies could fully restore what had been so carefully destroyed. One evening, Daniel showed up unannounced at Olivia's house, standing on the front porch with an expression of raw desperation Claire had never seen from him before, not even during their confrontation weeks earlier. "Please, just give me 5 minutes," he said when Claire opened the door cautiously, Olivia hovering protectively in the hallway behind her. "I'm not here to argue or make excuses. I just need you to know how sorry I am, and how much I regret everything." Claire stepped outside onto the porch, closing the door partially behind her, willing to hear him out one final time, though her expression remained carefully guarded. 5 minutes, she agreed. Daniel took a deep breath, his composure clearly fragile. "I know I destroyed something irreplaceable. I understand that now in a way I don't think I fully did during our conversation that night. I've ended things completely with Megan. I've started therapy, real therapy, trying to understand why I made the choices I made, why I let ambition and selfishness override everything that actually mattered. I'm not asking you to forgive me overnight. I'm just asking you not to close the door completely, not yet." Claire listened quietly, studying his face for any trace of the manipulative deflection he had shown during their initial confrontation, the attempts to blame her distance for his choices. She found, to her surprise, something that seemed more genuinely remorseful this time, though she remained uncertain whether that mattered enough to change her decision. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "I believe that you're sorry. I even believe that you love me in whatever way you're capable of loving someone alongside your ambition and your choices. But sorry doesn't undo 2 years of lies. It doesn't undo the years I spent making myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating, while you built an entire second life I knew nothing about." "So there's nothing I can do?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "There's nothing you can do to change what already happened," Claire said. "And I'm no longer willing to spend my future waiting to see whether the past repeats itself. I deserve better than constant uncertainty, Daniel. I deserve a partner who doesn't require betrayal and discovery before finally choosing to value me properly." Daniel stood silently on the porch for a long moment, absorbing her words, and Claire watched something shift in his expression. A slow, painful acceptance beginning to replace the desperate hope he had carried onto the porch. "I understand," he said finally quietly. "I won't keep pushing. I just needed you to know how genuinely sorry I am." "I know," Claire said softly, "and I hope, genuinely, that you find whatever growth you're looking for through therapy. But that growth needs to happen for your own sake now, not as a strategy to win me back." He nodded slowly, and after a long, silent moment, turned and walked back toward his car, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of genuine grief rather than performative desperation. Claire watched him drive away, feeling a complicated mixture of sadness and relief settle over her. Grief for the ending of something that had once been genuinely beautiful, relief that she had finally found the strength to protect herself from further harm. The following months brought their own complicated challenges. The divorce proceedings moved forward steadily, Ellen handling the negotiations with quiet, professional efficiency, ensuring Claire received a fair settlement that acknowledged both her financial contributions to Daniel's early business success and the emotional toll of the marriage's final years. Claire's family remained supportive throughout, though navigating their reactions proved its own kind of exhausting. Her mother, initially devastated by the news, eventually became one of her strongest sources of comfort, reminding Claire during a particularly difficult evening that strength sometimes looked like walking away rather than staying and fighting. "I raised you to know your own worth," her mother said gently, holding Claire's hand across the kitchen table one evening. "I'm heartbroken about how things turned out, but I am so proud of how you've handled this. You didn't let fear keep you trapped in something that was hurting you." Grace and Olivia remained constant sources of support throughout the difficult transition, helping Claire pack and organize her belongings, sitting with her through particularly hard evenings when grief threatened to overwhelm the clarity she had worked so hard to maintain, celebrating small victories alongside her as she slowly began reconstructing a life independent from the one she had shared with Daniel for over a decade. Slowly, gradually, Claire began finding pieces of herself that had been quietly buried beneath years of accommodation and sacrifice. She pulled her old painting supplies out of storage, setting up a small studio space in the corner of Olivia's guest room, and found, to her surprise, that the creative impulse she had feared might be permanently lost returned to her almost immediately, flowing through her hands as though it had simply been waiting patiently for permission to emerge again. She began painting regularly, sometimes late into the night, finding in the quiet, focused rhythm of brushstrokes a kind of healing she hadn't expected. The paintings from this period carried a different energy than her earlier work, more raw, more honest, infused with the complicated emotions of grief, anger, and slowly emerging hope that defined this new chapter of her life. Nearly 6 months after their initial confrontation, the divorce was finalized. Claire signed the final papers in Ellen's office on a bright, clear afternoon, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and profound relief as she set down the pen and closed the folder containing the official end of her 10-year marriage. "How do you feel?" Ellen asked gently, watching Claire's carefully composed expression. Claire considered the question honestly, taking a moment before answering. "Sad," she admitted, "but also lighter somehow. Like I've finally set down something I've been carrying for far too long." Walking out of the lawyer's office that afternoon, stepping into the bright sunlight of a warm spring day, Claire felt, for the first time in what seemed like years, that she was walking toward something rather than simply enduring whatever came next. The marriage that had once defined so much of her identity was officially over, but standing there on the sidewalk, breathing in the fresh air, she recognized with quiet certainty that an entirely new chapter was only just beginning. The small gallery on Maple Street buzzed with quiet conversation as guests moved slowly between canvases, pausing to study brushstrokes, nodding thoughtfully, occasionally breaking into soft laughter at some shared observation. Claire stood near the center of the room, wearing a simple green dress, watching people engage genuinely with the paintings she had spent the past year creating, and felt a warmth spreading through her chest unlike anything she had experienced in years. This was, finally, the exhibition she had once dreamed about, postponed and forgotten during her marriage, now fully realized on her own terms, in her own time, surrounded by people who had come specifically to see her work rather than to network for someone else's business interests. "These are incredible, Claire," said a woman Claire recognized as a local art critic, studying a large canvas depicting a woman standing alone on a shoreline, storm clouds gathering behind her, sunlight breaking through in the distance. "There's such raw emotion in this collection. Would you mind telling me a bit about your inspiration?" Claire smiled, considering the question carefully before answering. "These paintings came from a difficult period in my life," she said honestly. "A time when I had to rebuild myself from the ground up. I think that struggle shows through in the work, but so does the hope that eventually followed it." The critic nodded thoughtfully, making a note before moving on to study another piece, and Claire allowed herself a quiet moment to simply observe the room, filled with her own creations, filled with people genuinely appreciating something she had built entirely on her own. It had been nearly a year and a half since the divorce was finalized, and the journey between that difficult spring afternoon and this celebratory evening had been neither quick nor easy. Claire had spent the first several months after finalizing the divorce simply learning how to exist independently again, rediscovering routines and preferences that had been quietly subsumed into Daniel's schedule for so many years. She had moved into a small apartment of her own eventually, modest but entirely hers, decorated according to her own tastes without needing to consider anyone else's preferences. The first night she spent there alone, she remembered sitting on the floor amid unopened boxes, feeling a complicated mixture of loneliness and profound freedom, unsure yet how to name the strange, unfamiliar lightness settling over her. Her painting career, meanwhile, had grown steadily beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. What began as a private healing practice, brushstrokes applied late at night in Olivia's guest room, gradually transformed into something more substantial. She began submitting pieces to local competitions, initially out of simple curiosity, and found herself winning recognition that surprised and encouraged her. A gallery owner had discovered her work at a small community showcase and offered her this exhibition, an opportunity that felt, in many ways, like the universe finally delivering on a promise made years earlier and long forgotten. Olivia approached her from across the room, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water, her expression bright with genuine pride. "The turnout is incredible," she said, handing Claire a glass. "I always knew you had this in you." "I couldn't have gotten here without you," Claire said, squeezing her sister's hand gratefully. "You never let me forget who I was, even during the hardest months." "That's what sisters are for," Olivia said with a soft smile. "Though I have to say, watching you reclaim your life this past year has been one of the most inspiring things I've ever witnessed." Grace joined them shortly afterward, along with Peter, Daniel's old friend who had, somewhat unexpectedly, remained close with Claire even after the divorce, having witnessed firsthand how thoroughly Daniel's choices had damaged the marriage. Their small circle of support had grown steadily throughout the past year, a chosen family built through shared experience and genuine care rather than obligation. Later that evening, as the exhibition began winding down and guests slowly filtered out into the cool night air, Claire found herself standing alone for a moment near her favorite piece, the shoreline painting the critic had asked about earlier. She studied it quietly, remembering the late night she had created it, tears mixing with paint as she worked through grief that had felt, at the time, impossible to fully overcome. Looking at it now, finished and displayed proudly on a gallery wall, surrounded by evidence of a life successfully rebuilt, Claire felt something settle peacefully within her, a quiet acknowledgement that the storm depicted in the painting had indeed passed, leaving behind not devastation, but clarity and strength she hadn't known she possessed. She thought briefly about Daniel, wondering how he was doing, whether the growth he had promised during their final porch conversation had proven genuine or temporary. She felt, to her own quiet surprise, neither anger nor longing when she considered him now, simply a distant, settled peace, the kind that comes only after genuinely working through pain rather than simply suppressing it. She had heard, through mutual acquaintances, that Daniel had indeed continued therapy for several months before eventually stopping, that his relationship with Megan had ended shortly after the divorce was finalized, unable to survive outside the secretive excitement that had originally fueled it. She felt no satisfaction in this information, only a quiet, distant sympathy for a man who had sacrificed something genuinely valuable in pursuit of something ultimately hollow. As the last guests said their goodbyes and the gallery staff began preparing to close for the evening, Claire stepped outside into the cool night air, standing alone for a moment on the sidewalk, looking back at the warmly lit windows displaying her paintings to the quiet street. She thought about the woman she had been standing in that university library over a decade earlier, hopeful and uncertain, reaching for a book of poetry that would change the entire trajectory of her life. She thought about the woman she had slowly become during her marriage, quiet and accommodating, gradually losing pieces of herself in service of someone else's ambitions. And she thought about the woman standing on this sidewalk now, independent and increasingly confident, having rebuilt an entire life and career through nothing but her own persistent effort and quiet courage. She didn't know exactly what the future held, whether love would eventually find her again, whether her painting career would continue growing as steadily as it had this past year, whether new challenges waited around corners she couldn't yet see. But standing there, breathing in the crisp evening air, looking back at everything she had created and rebuilt with her own 2 hands, Claire felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely and completely at peace. She had walked away from a marriage built on quiet neglect and careful deception, uncertain at the time whether she possessed the strength required to survive such a devastating loss. But standing here now, surrounded by evidence of everything she had subsequently built, Claire understood clearly that walking away hadn't been an ending at all. It had been, in every meaningful sense, a beginning. 3 years passed, and the small apartment Claire had once moved into with a handful of boxes and an unfamiliar sense of loneliness had long since transformed into a warm, sunlit home filled with finished canvases, half-completed sketches, and the comfortable clutter of a life fully and confidently lived on her own terms. Her paintings now hung in 3 galleries across the region, and she had recently begun teaching advanced painting workshops to students eager to learn from her distinctive, emotionally honest style. On a bright autumn afternoon, Claire sat at a small cafe downtown, sketching absent-mindedly in a notebook while waiting for Grace to arrive for their weekly coffee catch-up. The cafe was busy, filled with the comfortable hum of conversation and the smell of fresh pastries, and Claire barely looked up when the bell above the door chimed, signaling another customer entering. It was only when a familiar voice spoke her name that she glanced up, mildly startled to find Daniel standing near her table, looking older somehow, though it had only been 3 years, his expression carrying a mixture of surprise and cautious warmth. "Claire," he said again, softer this time, "it's good to see you, you look wonderful." "Daniel," she replied, setting down her pencil, studying him with calm, unhurried curiosity rather than any lingering anxiety. "It's been a while." They exchanged brief, careful pleasantries, Daniel mentioning that he had recently stepped back from his consulting firm to focus on smaller, more meaningful projects, a shift Claire found genuinely surprising given how central ambition had once been to his identity. He asked about her painting career, and Claire found herself sharing the news of her recent gallery successes with a comfortable ease that would have seemed impossible during the raw, painful months following their divorce. "I saw one of your paintings featured in a magazine a few months back," Daniel admitted, a note of genuine pride creeping into his voice. "I always knew you had that talent in you. I'm glad you finally got the chance to fully pursue it." "Thank you," Claire said simply, neither dismissing the compliment nor allowing it to carry more weight than it deserved. There was a brief, comfortable silence between them, the kind that comes only after sufficient time has passed to heal what once felt like an unbearable wound. Daniel shifted slightly, glancing down at his hands before speaking again, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable. "I owe you an apology, a real one, not the desperate kind I offered back then trying to convince you to stay. I've had a lot of time to reflect on everything, on the choices I made, on how thoroughly I took you for granted during those years. I'm truly sorry, Claire, for everything I put you through." Claire considered his words carefully, feeling neither the sharp sting of old pain nor any lingering need for further explanation or closure. The apology, offered freely now without any expectation attached, felt genuinely different from the desperate pleading she remembered from their final conversations years earlier. "I appreciate you saying that," she said honestly. "I've made peace with everything that happened. It led me somewhere important, even though the path there was painful." "I'm glad," Daniel said, and Claire could see he genuinely meant it, whatever complicated mixture of regret and relief that acknowledgement carried for him. "You deserve every bit of happiness you've built for yourself." They spoke for a few more minutes, easy and unremarkable conversation about mutual acquaintances, changes in the neighborhood, ordinary details that no longer carried any emotional weight between them. When Grace finally arrived, Daniel excused himself politely, wishing Claire well one final time before disappearing back out into the busy afternoon street. Grace slid into the seat across from Claire, glancing curiously toward the door. "Was that Daniel?" "It was," Claire confirmed, picking her pencil back up, returning to her half-finished sketch with calm, steady hands. "How do you feel?" Grace asked carefully, studying her friend's expression. Claire considered the question honestly, surprised by how simple and clear the answer felt. "Fine," she said, and meant it completely. Genuinely fine. It's strange, but seeing him today, I didn't feel anger or sadness or even much nostalgia. Just a kind of quiet closure, like reading the final page of a book I'd already fully processed and moved past. Grace smiled warmly, reaching across the table to squeeze Claire's hand briefly before ordering their usual coffees from the approaching waiter. Their conversation moved easily into other topics: upcoming gallery shows, Grace's recent promotion at work, weekend plans neither of them had firmly decided yet, the comfortable rhythm of two close friends who had built a lasting bond through years of shared support and genuine care. Later that evening, walking home along familiar streets as the autumn sun began setting in warm shades of orange and gold, Claire found herself reflecting on the strange, unexpected encounter, on how thoroughly her life had transformed since those painful early months following her divorce. She thought about the woman who had once sat alone at a cold dinner table on her 10th wedding anniversary, waiting anxiously for a husband who never came home on time, quietly explaining away warning signs she desperately didn't want to see. She thought about the courage it had ultimately taken to gather evidence, to confront painful truths, to walk away from a decade of shared history, despite overwhelming uncertainty about what waited on the other side. She thought, too, about everything she had built in the years since: an independent life filled with genuine creative fulfillment, a chosen family of loyal friends and supportive relatives, a growing sense of self-worth that no longer depended on anyone else's attention or validation to feel complete. Claire understood now, walking peacefully through the golden evening light toward her own comfortable home, that the pain of discovering Daniel's betrayal, devastating as it had been, had ultimately served as the difficult catalyst for a far more meaningful transformation. She had lost a marriage she once believed defined her entire future, but in losing it, she had rediscovered herself completely, reclaiming dreams and strengths that had been quietly buried beneath years of accommodation and sacrifice. She reached her apartment building as the last light of sunset faded into the soft blue of early evening, climbing the familiar stairs to her cozy, sunlit home filled with canvases and half-finished paintings representing years of hard-won healing and growth. Standing in her doorway for a moment, looking back at the peaceful street below, Claire felt a quiet, settled gratitude for everything her difficult journey had ultimately taught her. She had once been a woman who waited quietly at home, slowly becoming invisible within her own marriage, accepting smaller and smaller portions of attention and respect until she nearly disappeared entirely. But she had refused, ultimately, to remain that woman forever. She had chosen, even when it terrified her, to walk toward the painful truth rather than continue hiding from it, and in doing so, had rediscovered a version of herself far stronger and more genuinely happy than she had ever believed possible. Closing her apartment door behind her, surrounded by the comfortable, familiar warmth of a life entirely her own, Claire smiled softly to herself, grateful, finally and completely, for the woman she had become,